we're just so happy that we could have you, and we do hope we can have you again.
Thank you, thank you. I've been coming here for 21 years. And each time is wonderful, seriously. So welcome back. Yeah, the Middle Ages and popular culture. Let's talk about takeaways, shall we? Thinking of what you asked me to emphasize last week. My idea about this class was just to talk about the weird ways in which the Middle Ages won't go away. Some of it is marketing, no question about it. Some of it is entertainment. Some of it is, the creativity of people who are in the arts, movie making, theater, songs, fiction, novels, fantasy literature, and so forth. And some of it may be something else, okay? Maybe there's a reason the Middle Ages won't go away. It's very interesting that in our ignorance of the medieval past, of medieval symbols, of medieval tropes, of medieval imagery, that an American president 20 years ago, basically this fall, said that we were launching a crusade to rid the world of evil the day after September 11th, 2001. And I mean, who can argue with that? The word crusade is a very common word in the English language. Right now, there are millions of doctors and nurses and epidemiologists and scientists all over the planet engaged in a crusade to save us and protect us from SARS-CoV-2, also known as COVID-19. And that is, in a way, a crusade. Okay? It is a war against this virus, against the pandemic. But maybe it shows something about the persistence of the Middle Ages, that on September the 12th of 2001, that word, that phrase was heard very differently in different places on this planet. For people of Arab or of Islamic or Persian ancestry, and remember, most of the world's Muslims do not live in the Middle East. They live outside of the Middle East in Southeast Asia, mainly along the Pacific rim of Southeast Asia. There was a different kind of story, a different kind of imagery that conjured up. Memories of a different past, of a different story of the last 500 years, of the last 700 years, of the last 1,000 years. Okay? And, believe it or not, it turns out that George Bush, okay, the son, was, the family is related to the family of Richard the Lionheart. Okay? No big deal. I bet some of you are related to royalty. We're all connected somewhere back in the midst of time. It meant absolutely nothing to me. To me, it was irrelevant. To me, it was as good as gibberish. But for people on the other side of the planet, okay, for whom the Crusades matter in a way that it doesn't matter to Americans, that was a very big deal. Because Richard the Lionheart is either famous or infamous, depending on which side of the story you're on, for trying to restart the Crusades after the Crusades had pretty much concluded in the year 1291. Okay? And so some people on the other side of the world, meaning on the Islamic, Arabic, Persian side of this, said, see, it's in his blood. Do you see how medievalism plays out? Think about that. Okay? Something that for most Americans, like, who cares? I don't care if you're related to an English king. Well, think again. For people on the other side of the world, I mean, I've traveled in Spain, I've traveled in other parts of the Middle East, and there are people who will bring you a sword that has been in the family for 700 years or longer. Why should that surprise us? Haven't you been to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, or Gettysburg? Haven't you been there and seen all the people of all ages, mostly men, reenacting the Battle of Gettysburg? I mean, it's an incredible sight to actually drive up to the hill and see the encampments all laid out. And some of the people saying, this sword has been in my family for 160 years. Or this cap, or this canteen, or this, belt. Some of the clothing, of course, would be difficult to survive 160 years. But other things, depending on what they're made of. So think about that. Because in a way, our reaction to 9/11, our collective mythological, notice mythological. I'm not saying military, I'm not saying political. Our mythological reaction to 9/11 was in some ways another example of medievalism. And it's not just our reaction. It was bin Laden's use and abuse of history. Because bin Laden made it very much about the Crusades. And so did Al-Qaeda. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's second in command, who is still alive, I think. Okay? Think about that. Okay? And 911 days after 9/11, notice the calculation. 911 days after September 11, 2001, exactly 911 days later, another terrorist group struck in Spain, outside of Madrid, in the region known as Alcalá de Henares, which is a suburb of Madrid, but also home to one of the major medieval universities. Late medieval universities, we could even say it was a Renaissance university. And they struck around rush hour. The death toll didn't quite reach 200, but tell that to any of the 100+ people who lost their lives and their loved ones. And I was fascinated by the terrorist note. I've never read the whole thing. I understand it's 16 pages long. I hope someday to read the entire note. It said this was part of settling old accounts with Spain, the great crusader. Okay? So the next time you think that medievalism is just a Hollywood thing, think again. In the minds of radicals, not only Islamic radicals, terrorists, jihadists, but in the minds of angry white young men, as I shared with you last week, in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, the Middle Ages are still alive and well. And again, it is the same use and misuse and abuse of history that we saw in the hands of bin Laden. For me, the most chilling moment after 9/11 came in October of 2001. Yes, that day was filled with tragedy and death and destruction and evil. But about a month later, bin Laden and his top lieutenants started making comments that one of the reasons they had done what they did was so that the tragedy of Al-Andalus would not be repeated. That's a direct quote. So that the tragedy of Al-Andalus would not be repeated. And the tragedy of Al-Andalus is the tragedy of 1492, when the golden age of Islam basically falls apart, comes to an end forevermore. On January 2nd of 1492, when the last Muslim kingdom on European soil was defeated by the Spanish monarchy. Okay? And yes, that's an incredible year. Because then the Spanish king said, hey, you know that eccentric guy, that pirate, that Columbus guy? Tell him we have money for his ships now. Because we just defeated Granada. And we're going to get some of the money from the Jews, even though we're kicking them out. I mean, when you think of all of the things that 1492 set in motion, all of the racialization, all of the imperialism, all of the colonialism, all of the Muslim versus Christian conflicts, you realize that in some ways medievalism is still alive and well. It's still alive and well. Okay? So again, I'm not trying to essentialize or romanticize the Middle Ages, But if you're wondering what you can take away from this class, in addition to all the entertaining stuff from movies and, or the quest for the Grail, maybe you're a Grail seeker yourself. Okay, maybe one day you will actually stumble upon that chalice. Remember though, it's just a little ways down the road over the bridge and you turn left. Okay? And usually the knights say, how could it be that easy? They'll say to the farmer or whoever tells them that. And yes, sometimes the grace of God is that simple when you least expect it. But in addition, beyond all of these pretty and entertaining and intriguing things, maybe the psychologists were right about 100, 120 years ago when they said, I'm afraid we've buried the Middle Ages too quickly. Carl Jung even says in one of his books that there's something about modern consciousness, about modern self-awareness that suffers from a latent medievalism. Okay? And that somehow medievalism is just underneath the surface of modern consciousness. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is. Why are so many angry young men in the Islamic world and in the white world of the Christianity? Why are they in love with the Crusades? Why do they think they can foment a world revolution by going back to knighthood and chivalry and the ideals of knighthood? Even though most of the medieval knights would say, no, you are the bad guys. You're the evil ones. Think about that. Yes.
Weren't there 3 different crusades?
There are many crusades.
I remember watching a show on TV.
Yeah, there are many, many
And they
crusades.
said there was actually the big one, and then after that there was 3 more.
Actually, there's about 7 official crusades,
Oh, really?
but those are only the ones to the Middle East,
Okay.
to retake Jerusalem. There are 2 different kinds of crusades. There's the crusades to the Holy Land, to Palestine, to retake Jerusalem from the Arabs. And then there's the crusade to reconquer Spain from the Muslims. And I'm not sure that the crusades to the Holy Land influenced Europe more than the crusade in Spain and Portugal. It's just that, again, pardon?
Which one was first?
The crusade in Spain started in the year 756. Some would say it started in the year 711. And the crusades to the Holy Land, or to Palestine, started in 1095. So more than 300 years earlier. So for 300 years, our Christian ancestors were crusading in Spain. It's just that because England dominates English, the history written in the English language, we tend to see the world only through the eyes of medieval England or of early modern England. But England is meaningless. It's a newcomer in the medieval world. England becomes a great superpower around the year 1588, around the year 1600, but by 1600 the Middle Ages was already more than 1,000 years old. But the Reconquest is what it's called, the Spanish Reconquest, may have been the most important crusade of all. And it goes on for 750 years. Depends who you talk to. I tend to think it started in 711. Okay. Others would say, no, it started in 756, but it does not end until the year 1492. Yeah, and that, in his twisted mentality, bin Laden thought was the greatest tragedy in Islamic history. And that's one of his rationales for doing what he did, which is absolutely absurd. But it goes to show you that in the minds of certain people, history is a lot bigger than just a 4-year cycle. And we Americans tend to be programmed to think in 4-year cycles because of our political system. But that's not the way people outside, elsewhere on this planet think. So I would hope that one of your takeaways from this class is the persistence of the Middle Ages, not just as medievalism in popular culture, but the persistence of the Middle Ages in terms of unresolved woundedness, of unresolved conflicts, okay? And especially the conflict among the children of Abraham. It's still with us. It is still with us. Anti-Semitism is out of control again in the United States of America. Okay? Anti-Semitism is out of control in many parts of Europe as well, and in other countries. And that's one of the legacies of medievalism, or of the Middle Ages. The idea that the Jews betrayed Christ. You know? The Middle Ages gives us that. The Middle Ages gives us incredible persecution of other religions. And the conflict between Islam and Christianity is one of the fabrications of the Crusade era. You know? It was about land, it was about religion, but it was much more about land than about religion. So, the other takeaway is, you know, again, I don't have an answer for you, but maybe we do need to ask ourselves is, why is this stuff still so popular? What is it with the modern imagination that not only young men, but people of all ages are fascinated by these medieval mythological, you know, I mean, again, dragons, right? Game of Thrones, okay? Which does a very poor job of being historical. But the costumes are pretty good, the castles are pretty good, the dragons are incredible. And the warrior queens are something, you know. Or Joan of Arc, our ongoing fascination with Joan of Arc. Why? You know? I mean, she was real, but we've mythologized her. You know, we've imbued so many symbols and stories and fantastic twists and turns to her life story. And in many ways, she was a victim of a male-dominated society, of an incredibly violent male-dominated society. Our fascination with Robin Hood won't go away. Every few years, Hollywood produces another Robin Hood movie, and it's always a hit. And these are old ones. You know, Russell Crowe was in an incredible one just a few years ago that did very, very well at the box office and was very accurate historically in terms of the costuming, in terms of what we think we know about Robin Hood. We're not even sure Robin Hood existed, but we think someone that fit that mold, fit that pattern, fit that image did exist. What else? I mean, really think about this stuff, you know? This image that bothered many of you. I mean, some people really literally want to live their medieval mythology. They want to put it on their bodies, you know? St. George and the Dragon, St. Michael, the Archangel, as a slayer of evil, still is very popular, you know? So again, I don't know what all of this means, but it means something. And it's more than just marketing. It's more than just marketing. And then there's this kind of stuff that I think disturbed some of you last week. You know, again, looks harmless, but it's a recruitment poster from the dark web for so-called modern Templar, neo-Nazi, white supremacist. Christian nationalism is the term we're using more and more for this. Christian nationalism. This is God's country, love it or leave it. Really? Since when did God side with only one country against all others? Watch out with that one. The Germans thought they were favored by God. Hitler said so. Hitler in his speeches said, "I have come to finish the work of the Protestant Reformation." Imagine what a mess he delivered, huh? As soon as he came into power, he turned on the churches. He was just using them. So again, you know, I don't know what all of this means. I do think we need to be careful with romantic medievalism, that version of medievalism that goes back to the 1830s. You know, this idea that somehow a woman's love will save the man, that the man goes out and does all of these incredible feats of bravery for the love and the favor of his beloved. You need to be very careful with that stuff because the Middle Ages were not kind to women at all. And yet this kind of medievalism is everywhere. Here's another example of it from a romance novel. Here's another one. This one's a photograph from modern day costume play. I mean, you know, this stuff is everywhere. Here's one from the 1830s. Interesting, the woman isn't even wearing a medieval dress. It's a dress from the early 1800s. Well, if you were a widow, you weren't it's hard to talk about medieval women because the Middle Ages covers more than 1,000 years. And we could talk about medieval women in France in 1250 to 1280. Or we could talk about medieval women in Spain from 1150 to 1180. Or we could talk about late medieval women in Italy, in northern Italy, in the 1200s. You see what I'm getting at? So it's very difficult to generalize. But it was a world in which a woman who lost her spouse due to illness or due to death in war, in crusading, for example, the culture wasn't very kind to them. You know, in much of medieval Europe, a woman was not allowed to hold private property. So at some point, older males would come and say, what are we going to do with your lands and your holdings and your wealth? Obviously, she could keep some of it, but they weren't going to let her keep an estate of 10,000 acres. And so oftentimes she was forced to marry a relative. It could be a brother-in-law who was single, or maybe the brother-in-law himself was widowed. It could be an uncle. It could be a cousin. And sometimes age differences didn't matter because what mattered was the bloodline and the property. So in that sense, much of medieval civilization is very unfair to women, or the idea that a woman could not appear in public without a male representative, and that she was expected to lower her gaze when being addressed by men of higher rank. And that she was expected to be obedient to her husband, and rarely did medieval women win the right to request a divorce. Rarely. Rarely were they even entrepreneurs of their own. I mean, we have a few, you know, eventually the culture starts to open up. But that's very much what I mean by that. And yet when the men were off crusading, or when they were off, performing their military service under the feudal contract, it's the women who ran the estates and the manors. There's a movie out right now called The Last Duel. It does an incredible job of portraying the courage of a medieval. It's based on a true story, and it is an example of medievalism in popular culture. It does a wonderful job of portraying the female heroine's courage in accusing a man of raping her, and yet an incredible job of portraying the machinery of a male-dominated culture to silence her and obliterate her. Okay? I won't say more because if you're going to go see it, I don't want to give it away. Some of the stuff in the movie is ridiculous. It's pure medievalism for entertainment. What do you expect when... forgot their names. Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. Yeah. They're like 40-something-year-old, 16-year-olds. Yeah, some of what they do is just silly. You know, some of their antics, some of their womanizing on the side is just silly. Some stuff that would never have happened in the Middle Ages. The battle scenes are incredible. The costuming deserves an Oscar nomination. But it's interesting to me the way that the plight of the woman who is raped and then accused and then brings charges against her, against the man who violated her. And it's based on a true story. Okay? So rape was very common, and men were rarely brought to justice in medieval law, even in medieval church law. Yeah. So those are the things that I'm hoping you'll take away. You know, chivalry is still with us. You know, think of all those little things that we expect, not just men, but also women. You know, I think I told you that our modern marriage ceremony is a medieval ceremony. The way it's set up, you know, the way the bride is given away, the court, the ladies in waiting, the fellow knights represented by, you know, the bride, the groomsmen and the bridesmaids. Medievalism is with us even in the way we dress up on graduation day. Why do we wear robes? Because someone in the late 1700s decided, let's start wearing robes again, which is the way that medieval universities processed for graduation. So that's an example of medievalism that is still with us. And if you look carefully at the robes that the faculty wear, there are ranks. And there are ways of designating who's a member of the history faculty, who's a member of the science faculty, you know, who's a full professor, depending by, again, the ways in which the robes are decorated. And there's different color robes for different universities, and different color hoods for different academic specializations. So the Middle Ages is still with us in that. And in some ways, the Middle Ages is still with us on Halloween, which we just celebrated not too long ago. And in some ways, the Middle Ages is still with us on All Souls Day and on All Saints Day, which are, again, medieval feast days, medieval holidays. Get it? Holy days, holidays. The modern celebration of Halloween, however, dates to the late 1800s. Interesting, it's the era of Romantic medievalism. And a lot of communities in the United States tried to ban Halloween because of the vandalism that went on in the 1920s and 30s. From people getting carried away drinking and carried away, you know, destroying private property and public property. Kind of like Boulder 2 weeks ago on Halloween, the night before Halloween. On Saturday, October the 30th, they had a mess on their hands up in Boulder. What started out as a simple Halloween celebration turned into a mass act of vandalism. So again, many of these things are still with us. Let me give you another example of some of what is still with us, okay? I've talked a lot about the movie Kingdom of Heaven. Here's an example of medieval technology, medieval military technology, that is an example of medievalism in popular culture. There are competitions in the United States and in Europe and in many other countries to see who designs the best trebuchet. A trebuchet is a medieval catapult. This one is life-size. This is from the movie set Kingdom of Heaven. Okay? A good trebuchet could take a ballista, usually a very big rock, polished, you know, sometimes covered in rags, dipped in tar or in gasoline, and then lit. So it's like a fireball. This was before the cannon. Trebuchets are developed in France and then mastered in Spain. Mastered by the House of Aragon, the most powerful house of medieval Spanish chivalry. Let me show you, I have a bunch of these. Here's one of the scenes from Kingdom of Heaven in the midst of battle. A trebuchet. The objective in this movie was to bring down the walls of Jerusalem so that the forces of the Arabs could take Jerusalem and liberate it from the Christian Crusaders who had controlled it for nearly 200 years. Of course, the Christians said, no, we liberated it from you 200 years ago. And then here is one of the nighttime battle scenes from Kingdom of Heaven. This must have scared the hell out of people, okay? I mean, you know, imagine 300 of these things flinging, you know, stone balls on fire and hitting with significant impact, okay? The walls are falling inside the city. I mean, really, it must have terrified people. Of course, the people inside the city fought back. They had their own trebuchet, and they had their own other ballistic weapons, you know, to shoot an arrow long distance and to set the arrow on fire and hopefully set the trebuchet on fire. A trebuchet needed an entire team. Here's a diagram of one trebuchet from the internet. Okay, this is a fairly small one, and they're powered by gravity, and you could get sliced in half if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, when someone cut that line, or when someone released that line. Cut in half or have your neck snapped, like nothing. But notice how many men usually were required to operate a trebuchet. Usually we estimate it was 4 to 7 men just to operate it in battle. And you had to have someone standing by in order to put out the fire in case there was an accident or in case someone shot flaming arrows at your trebuchet. Okay? And again, imagine a few hundred of these on either side of the battle. Woo! Incredible. Incredible.
And then we graduated to a cannon.
Exactly. And yet, look, we're still building them. For sport, for fun, for competition. You can see the brand new one here in the middle with the brand new wood. Again, this hobby can get you killed. But you can win prizes. Here's a smaller one. Notice how unprepared this guy is. He has no protective gear on. I hope he had it somewhere in a bag not too far away, and he just hadn't put it on yet. But look how early we start them. Here's a boy with a little trebuchet. Did he build it himself? Did his father, his uncle, his grandfather help him build it? Is he captivated by medieval mythology and the medieval lore of chivalry? Well, why not? Some of it is fun. Remember, I dress up too, as I showed you last week. And of course, what do we usually do after Halloween? We have our exactly, pumpkin chunkin'. Exactly, it's big in Colorado. In fact, I believe this scene may be from Colorado. All over the U.S. and in Europe and in some parts of Latin America. Here's another scene. Again, notice the carelessness of some of these people in terms of not being prepared. A pumpkin can still break bones. Here's a close-up. This one is from France, and you can see he's a reenactor. He's dressed in late medieval Renaissance attire.
I wouldn't want those sleeves around it.
That's right. That's a little impractical. But this is a small trebuchet. Imagine the power of the big ones that can fling something 1,200 yards.
So they'd be pulled by multiple horses?
Yes. Yes, they were on sleds, carts or sleds. Yeah, and look, just so you don't think the women don't get into it, here is a picture from somewhere USA. I don't think they're chunkin' pumpkins. It looks like a ball. Again, these are also science experiments. history class experiments where people build these. I don't know what these guys are up to, but, you know, a 5-gallon bucket could kill you too. If depends on what's inside of it. But again, notice they probably built this themselves from a kit they got off the internet. I think that covers it. Did I forget to show you any? No. So again, you know, medievalism is with us. Here's one example. You know, I'm not sure that the one on the far left is legal. It looks like it's made of metal. Maybe they didn't enter that one in the competition. There's all kinds of rules governing this. I believe this is the European Championship from 2019. So again, medievalism is with us. It's alive and well, and it's very popular. What do you think? Thoughts, comments, reactions, reflections? Yes.
Back to what you were saying earlier about the Crusades.
Yes.
How much did those, or that mentality that flowed into the modern era, when after World War II, America and mostly the Western Allies basically kicked out all the, you know, Palestinians and everyone else out of Jerusalem, and then created it into, you know, the Jewish state of Israel.
Yeah.
How much of that was sort of, you know, I know that weird conceptions of Christianity played into it, but, you know, how much of that sort of mentality from the Crusades saying, well, this belongs to me?
Yeah, that's a good question. For many people in the Middle East, let's just say in the Arab, Persian, Islamic world, and not all of those three things are not the same. For many people, the memory of that incredible conflict that many people of Arab, Persian, or Islamic ancestry still believe ruined their golden age. For many people, it's not just the creation of the state of Israel, it's what France, England, the United States, and Russia did after World War II, where in many ways they basically, you know, put out the map of the Middle East and drew boundaries and said, all right, well, this part is yours. This part is ours. No, I want that part. Well, if you want this part, you got to give me part of that. You know, in a sort of imperial way, that wreaked havoc. Because in some cases, we forced people to coexist that had not coexisted or didn't get along at all with each other. In some ways, we're still trying to undo that stuff. Afghanistan is an example of that disaster. You know, so there's that. On the other hand, you might say that the creation of the State of Israel was one of the most morally right things that the Western powers ever did after the Holocaust. You could say that. But do two wrongs make a right when you consider the Palestinians had already lived there for 700 years? And that the Palestinians are themselves an outgrowth of medieval culture, of medieval civilization. You know, I know right now if I was saying this in a predominantly Jewish audience, I would just have angered a bunch of people. But I'm a historian and, you know, I get paid to think of both sides in the same way that I get paid to remember. Get it? History, remember? Your question, though, also makes me think that the officers who fought in World War II and the officers who fought in World War I all were issued ceremonial swords. And in the case of the British and the French and the Germans and the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the Dutch, and we could go on, they even had a little breastplate. Instead of a dog tag, it was a breastplate to represent that many of them were knights. Knights of the British Empire, knights of this, knights of that. And you know, so they you know, in Hollywood we know them because they have a side pistol, a sidearm, and a sword. Even though, you know, it's modern warfare with machine guns and, you know, planes dropped from I mean, bombs dropped from airplanes. But notice how the mentality of medievalism, the mentality of chivalry, went with us to World War I, and then went with us again to World War II. And I would say that in the horrors of World War I and World War II, we probably finally got over some of our medieval chivalry that influenced the way we conduct war. You know, this idea that you're supposed to take a break to tend to the wounded. This idea that maybe you're supposed to take a break so that you can eat. This idea that you're not supposed to attack under the cover of darkness. Or this idea that maybe you're not supposed to attack civilian populations. All of those rules were in place on the day that World War I started, particularly in Europe. Those rules are pretty much obliterated by World War I and then completely obliterated by World War II. And the US military is an example of a fighting force that can now fight 24/7 under any conditions and prefers to come in the cover of darkness when the enemy least expects it. You know, it's like, I mean, really, it's just some of the stuff is incredible. I don't know if you've ever seen movies of the first U-boats. The first German U-boats felt that they had to respect the Geneva Convention of War, the rules of European warfare. Okay, and so there are films of German U-boats from the first few years of World War I surfacing and telling a merchant ship, even though the merchant ship might be armed to protect itself, you're about to be sunk, you have 30 minutes, you have an hour to deboard. If you don't have lifeboats, you know, do the best that you can, but we are going to sink you. And then the U-boat would back up at a particular time, usually 30 to 60 minutes later, and fire its torpedoes and sink the ship. The Allies then got really smart and started arming the merchant ships even more than they had been armed before. And when the merchant ships started firing back, the U-boats decided, oh, okay, well, we're now going to use these submarines the way they were designed, to attack by stealth and by surprise. And the tonnage of merchant shipping that was lost is incredible, incredible. Not just in World War I, but then again in World War II. Think about this stuff. I mean, what absurdity in a way, you know? I created this killing machine, okay? Thinking of now about German technology, they created this killing machine, a submarine, and yeah, it's going to surface and say, oh, by the way, we're sorry, but we're going to sink you. I mean, really, it's incredible. But the ultimate horror of World War I that your question reminds me of is the machine gun and the Battle of the Somme in August of 1914. That morning, the British and the French, joined by auxiliaries from a few other Allied countries, basically sounded the trumpet. The officers unsheathed their swords, and they got out of their trenches and they marched on the German trench lines. And the Germans were waiting with modern-day mechanized machine guns that could shoot 600 rounds a minute. Okay, think about this, 600 bullets a minute. And they had positioned them so that when one was turning this way, the other one was turning. So basically, they were overlapping fields of fire. On the first day of battle, at the Battle of the Somme, there were 58,000 casualties. That was the day medieval styles of warfare died forever, along with thousands and thousands of young men, English, French, Belgian, you know, Germans too. Think about that. It just, and of course, what did we call the men and women who drove the ambulances? Does anyone remember their American history?
They were all conscientious objectors.
Yes. And they chose instead to drive ambulances. Some of them were artists and novelists. Hemingway was one of them. They called them the Lost Generation because they never got over the carnage that they witnessed. To them it was absurd. And to think that all sides in World War I blessed their troops under the same Christian God. as they went off to battle. And at the Battle of the Somme, which lasted for 2 weeks, 1.5 million casualties for a mere 1,200 yards of trench. They called it no man's land because all the bombs made that stretch of earth worthless. Okay? That's, to me, as a historian, that is the moment that medieval chivalry and medieval knighthood died as a form of warfare, as a form of battle. In World War I, we still used cavalry for the last time in modern history. And of course, you can imagine what became of the horses and the knights, the mounted knights. I mean, we could go on and on with examples of this. The airplanes, early in World War I, were not supposed to bomb civilian targets, even if it was a factory where guns and bombs and bullets were being made. A few months into the war, forget this. No. We're going to drop bombs on towns and cities. We have no choice. You see? It's and then imagine, roll that ahead 30 years or 20 years to World War II. And this idea of carving out land and saying, okay, well, that's yours. That's also a form of medievalism. Medievalism is about the exchange of land for military service, or the exchange of land for being an ally. And in a way, what the powers, the Allied powers that win World War II, what they do with Africa, parts of Africa, and almost the entire Middle East, is a form of latent medievalism. I mean, some would say, no, it's colonialism or imperialism. And I would say, well, to me, colonialism and imperialism is hyper-feudalism. Okay? It's feudalism on steroids. Because now you have modern mechanized warfare, and you don't just have a fiefdom the size of Littleton. No. You have a nation the size of Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq or Palestine, for that matter, or Egypt. So yeah, maybe those psychologists were right. Maybe there is something about medievalism that we haven't exactly let go of. Even though we think the Middle Ages were ignorant, stupid, superstitious, warlike, cruel because of the Inquisition, insane because of the witch burnings. Be careful, that which we demonize sometimes is maybe closer to our minds and hearts than we think. So, yes, why don't we have some Q&A before we take a break? Yes?
Let's go back to something you said about the Muslim, Arab, Persian, whatever all it was. They considered something the end of their golden age. Now,
Yes.
I was taught that, in that period in Spain particularly, I guess, the Muslims, anybody using this as a general term, were creating all these things like algebra and the
Yes.
zero and all this other stuff.
Yes.
And medicine and all this.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, nothing.
Yes, you were taught correctly.
What happened?
Well, they believed that the Crusades wrecked their Renaissance. They believed that then colonialism and imperialism after 1492 further wrecked their golden age. There is some truth to that. There are imams that I've worked with who specialize in political science who believe that we should use 1492 as the beginning of the modern world. None of us American or European historians do that. We consider 1492 still part of the Middle Ages. But maybe it says something about Arab, Persian, and Islamic consciousness that many of them believe that 1492 was a turning point. On one side of 1492, one kind of world is possible, and on the other side of 1492, a very different kind of world is possible. Now, I don't mean to romanticize Islam or Arabic or Persian culture, but it is true that without what happens in Damascus, Baghdad, Alexandria, Cairo, Salamanca in Spain, Seville in Spain, we don't have our Renaissance in Europe. Without that stuff, without those accomplishments, algebra, astronomy, optics. Without that stuff, we don't have the Renaissance in Europe later on. And because, history is written by the victors, by the conquerors, we've done a pretty good job of trying to write those legacies and contributions out of the historical record. It's changing, though. It's changing. The textbooks that are coming out nowadays for high school and college introductory courses are telling a more complete story. It's changing. But yeah, even the father of modern medicine, Outler, okay, a Canadian transplant to Maryland, to Johns Hopkins University and Medical Center in the US. Even he said, everything that I've done, I basically was inspired by this Muslim book written in the year 1000. Seriously, look it up. Okay.
So they just weren't, really pushed them all back out of Spain and further east.
Yeah.
So they weren't allowed to do anything?
Well, we fomented revolution among them. Kind of like the way we took over the Indians. We used Indians to fight Indians. And I'm not just saying the English. The Spaniards were incredible at that. The French were really good at that. Germ warfare. The colonial powers weaponized smallpox. But Islam also was at war with itself. The struggle between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and the struggle between the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman Turks and the rest of the Islamic world. And of course, the Western powers capitalized on that through divide and conquer tactics. Because a house divided cannot stand. And, if you really want to disrupt and create chaos, well then, further the disunity. Really. Yeah. But again, we need to be careful not to romanticize the past, but also careful not to scapegoat the past. And I'm always trying to find the right balance between those things. I don't want to romanticize it too much, but I don't want to scapegoat it too much either. Yes.
Are you familiar with the book, What Went Wrong? What Went Wrong, out of Princeton University?
I think so.
It's a total examination of the leveling out of the achievements of the Islamic.
I am familiar with it. Yes. Yes.
And it just kind of wore out. As I recall, a long time ago.
All good things must come to an end. Our own Renaissance came to an end in the 1600s. And who knows, maybe the American century is coming to an end.
I would think
Maybe the Pax Americana, as we've called it since World War II, is coming to an end. Maybe the future of the human race is in Asia and not in the United States. I disagree, but didn't mean to depress you there. No, really, think about it. The wonders of Islam are in the history books. The wonders of the Renaissance are in the history books. We had our moment of brilliance. The question is there an American Renaissance coming? Are we moving into an American Renaissance? And the verdict on that is still out. Although right now the United States is being referred to as the comeback nation. The comeback nation. COVID hell is almost everywhere on this planet, except in the United States of America. COVID hell. Okay? If you think we're losing a lot of people a day, oh my God. If you start reading the data and the statistics from other countries, it is unbelievable. Just unreal. You know, we're losing like 1,300 or so people per day. 2 weeks ago, we were losing 1,630 something per day. There are countries still losing 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 people a day. So, yeah, believe it or not, that's one of our nicknames right now, the comeback nation. We have more vaccine than anyone else on the planet. And there are thousands and thousands of Americans who don't want to get vaccinated. But people in other countries would give their lives for a vaccine. I got to stop. I'm starting to preach or moralize. Yes.
Another question, several times over the last 4 classes, you referred to the people in the Middle Ages that they were not non-sexual, but that they were very narrow with their sexuality. And the thing that's kind of occurred to me is humans are humans are humans. And so isn't that sort of a misnomer to think that they weren't, bumping uglies like everyone does in every part of history?
They were bumping uglies. In medieval culture, premarital sex was encouraged. Because this is one of the stereotypes that we have, that the church scoffed at that. But in a society where the transmission of property and of power is essential through offspring, if it didn't work in the bedroom, then the marriage might as well be abandoned. And so not only was there premarital sex in medieval civilization, but be careful because I'm generalizing across 1,200 years, sometimes a grandmother or 2 grandmothers or a grandmother and an aunt or 2 mothers would hide in the marital chamber on the night of the wedding to make sure that the marriage had been consummated and that the couple actually got along with each other in bed. Because again, the transmission of that lineage was absolutely crucial. And men who did divorce their wives often did so because the wife could not bear children. And in the feudal system, in the feudal contract, the transfer of property through offspring was crucial. Now granted, I'm talking about the upper classes. But one of the reasons we don't know more about medieval sexuality is that we've only been talking about our personal lives for about 250 years. So I, as a historian, can find very little in the historical record to tell me about their sexual lives or their sexual orientation. There were gay people, there were bisexual people, there were transgender people. There were women who dressed up as men so that they could be knights. There was a woman who passed herself off as a priest so that she could be a pope. Pope Joan. True story. I don't know how much of it is true, but it's true enough that the Vatican, not the Vatican, it didn't exist yet. It's true enough that St. Peter's in Rome created a special chair where a new pope was supposed to sit without underwear on, and a specially appointed medical examiner would check to make sure that he was a man. Okay? If they invented such a chair, then obviously something must have happened, okay, to require that invention. So I think the problem is more that we just don't know, because it's only from like the 1700s that people have been encouraged to write about their personal lives. And it's mainly through modern literature, modern novels, modern autobiographies. Medieval people would think that some of our TV shows about the private lives of celebrities is just absolutely disgusting and in poor taste. Medieval culture didn't really care about that kind of thing, not because they were better than we are, but just because, again, the private realm, the personal realm, was not intended to be publicized out in public. Yeah. So we also know that there were tons and tons of affairs in medieval aristocracy, because generally you were told whom to marry by your parents, and in some cases you were betrothed to another person when you were 8, 9, 10 years old. There were marriages that occurred sometimes between teenage girls and men in their 30s and 40s, which today we would be like, whoa, impossible. But oftentimes also it was a boy and a girl betrothed to each other at age 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And what if they weren't incompatible? What if one of them was gay? We know that those problems occurred. But it was that's why Romeo and Juliet was such a big hit when Shakespeare wrote it, because it was about a teenage boy and a teenage girl who had the guts to choose love over duty, over social duty, over obedience to their parents. And what are Juliet's parents worried about at the beginning of the play? Oh my God, she's 13 years old and we still don't have a suitor for her. Worried that she would become, what's the... Exactly, exactly. So there you have another, and that's from the late 1500s and 1600s, when there's still, you know, medieval culture still exists. So yeah, thank you for asking that. That was a really good question. Yeah. Anything else before we take a break? All right, well, when you come back from the break, I think we should talk a little bit about the phenomenon of the Da Vinci Code. And really the medieval detective story and history book that started it all. And then we'll have some more Q&A. Okay? Oh, and by the way, I'll pass this out after the break. I brought a list, suggestions for reading about medievalism. Each one guaranteed to cure insomnia. You gotta laugh at this stuff. All right, I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, that was that book. I gave it to a friend of mine, and she read it, and she read it. She said it was good. I started to read it, but
Pardon?
I'm sure you're going to go into it, but I'm very interested in present Opus Dei.
Oh, sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen pictures of this brand new building that they've built, and I guess I would tie that into popular culture.
And it's big in the Da Vinci Code.
Oh,
Actually, in the rest of Dan Brown's novels.
Right.
They're like the bad
Angels and
guys.
demons.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, and if I forget, just ask me.
Okay.
Just in
Same
case.
with the Priory of Zion.
Oh my God, yes.
I want to know about both
I will
of them.
definitely mention that one.
We just all watched the Da Vinci Code
Oh,
again
cool.
to be ready for you.
Okay, cool.
Speaking of insomnia, I was a math major, and I don't know why I was reading this. It's this theory of design or topology or something. And the example they were using was the four-leaf clover interchange on interstates.
Interesting.
In about 3.5 minutes, the thing would put me to sleep. The design of a cloverleaf interchange and exploring it to the infinite detail, and it was just super boring.
And imagine that's some of the stuff that they talked about in medieval architecture, about how to pull off all the design features of the cathedrals.
And being a math major, one of my college classes was, how to lie with statistics. I took non-financial stats, and the only way I got through it was they would assign the homework yesterday, you do it tonight, that night. He explains it tomorrow. And then the next night assignment, once he explained it tomorrow, I did that homework tonight. I was a day behind. And the one class that required me, a summer session class, to get enough credits to
Oh
graduate.
my God, thank you.
Was vector analysis.
Oh, fascinating.
And the teaching assistants were Palestinians or Arabs or, whatever. It never made sense. I was in seeing the TA every day. And there's a cutoff date when you could cancel without a passing grade. Well, I would push that date beyond, so I was beyond that. And I was seeing this guy so much that final was coming up. And he let me drop the class without a passing grade.
Wow.
And then I had to, I was short a credit and a half, so I had to take a class in this first summer session. So it turned out to be photography. And that got me enough credits to be able to get a degree.
Gosh.
But the essence of design or something, and the design of a cloverleaf interchange on the superhighway put me to sleep right away.
Thanks for sharing that.
You haven't mentioned my favorite reference to the Middle Ages,
Which one?
Monty Python.
Oh,
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
yes. Good point. Maybe because my students are always poking fun at my material by quoting Monty Python.
Because we're old.
So after Spain became a country, which was the next country? Or did, like, France was next?
France and England followed in quick succession.
Okay, and then Italy?
Italy is not a country until 1835, 1838.
Oh, they came much later.
Many, many years later. And Germany as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Germany did not exist until like 1780, 1778.
Weren't those like little duchies?
Yes, yeah, little kingdoms.
Yeah, they called them.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Book, and they were duchies, and then they all.
Yeah, the first modern nation states are Spain, followed by France, followed by England, and the Netherlands. The Dutch were a major power, a major power. In fact, the Dutch still own more real estate in the United States than several dozen countries combined.
So England was, part, was Ireland too, right? Ireland and Wales, is that all part of that?
Well,
England, Ireland?
English colonialism or English imperialism first focuses on absorbing those other cultures and those other peoples into the United Kingdom. and England and Ireland were at odds until just recently. You know, I mean, we were all born in an era when Irish terrorists were still wreaking havoc on the English. Yeah. Yeah, and then Portugal comes within that beginning as well.
With the Spain area?
Yes, Portugal broke away from Spain. Spain wanted to control Portugal no matter what. Had its own crusade to conquer Portugal, and the Portuguese put up an incredible fight and absolutely refused to be absorbed.
Across the river there.
Literally, yeah. But again, because of Portugal's maritime empire, and because they found a shortcut to Asia where Columbus failed, Portugal gained tremendous wealth. Tremendous wealth. It is, but imagine the Netherlands. But imagine the Netherlands is even smaller, and yet the power of the Dutch in the colonial era is incredible. Dutch companies, Dutch seafaring, New Amsterdam, Manhattan Island. I mean, really, it's incredible. And then the English. By 1700, it's the English, the French, and the Spanish that are the major powers of Europe. and are also the major colonial powers. And then they go to war, they're constantly at war with each other. And that culminates in World War I in many ways. And then World War II, I mean, really, when you think about it, it's just been one conflict after another. And the future will say that the unresolved conflicts of the 20th century continued into the 21st century, maybe even into the 22nd and 23rd century. Because when you think about our rivalry with Russia and our rivalry with China, my God, you know, it's alive and well all over again. And Putin and Xi may be the two most dangerous people on the planet as far as I'm concerned. So not that I'm a warmonger, and not that I'm demonizing and projecting onto the other, but we do need to keep a very close eye on what the Russians are doing and what the Chinese are doing.
Given all that background, look at the success of the EU in contrast.
Yes.
Not that it's perfect, but
No, but they have turned things around.
it's amazing
Yeah.
when you stop and think what
Yeah.
enemies they were.
True, true. Good point, good point. And the euro is stronger than the dollar and has been from the beginning.
There's much to be celebrated in that
Yeah,
area.
that is true. Finally, Europe made peace with itself.
I hope they can hold on to it.
I hope so too, but the Russians are knocking on the door. Unfortunately. Anyway, so I have a reading list for you. Why don't you take one and pass it around? Here you go. Take one and pass it around. There's 25 copies. I'll wait till those make their way around the room, and then I'll just say a few things about the titles that are on there. I wasn't kidding. Some of these can be very boring because scholars wrote them for other scholars, and we scholars have a way of writing books that only 6 to 10 people read. But academic libraries buy them, and you know, it is what it is. So there's the Cambridge Companion to Medievalism at the top of the list. That's a very accessible book for the general reader. You may not want to buy it. You could probably find it in any library. The United States of Medievalism is a relatively new book. Fascinating. It's about medievalism in American culture. Whose Middle Ages? Teachable Moments for an Ill-Used Past. That one is a series of short little articles for teachers, but I think it's interesting for general readers too, because it shows you the controversies that we could get ourselves into as teachers, depending on what we choose to teach from the Middle Ages. Got to be really careful with some of this stuff. One teacher that I came across once assigned Dante's Inferno. You know what that is? Okay, it's the first section from Dante's Divine Comedy, and it's about hell. And the assignment was, if you were writing your own version of the Inferno, whom would you put in it?
My
Okay.
husband had to do that in high school.
Yeah, that's opening up a can of worms, in my opinion.
It was really fun. We picked this realtor who lived in our neighborhood who was really awful and actually did ads in the movie theater about how he walked on water. And so she put him in the deepest layer of hell. And we all came up with fun things that happened to him.
Well, I'm glad it was a fun exercise.
Very entertaining.
It gets a little more complicated when you start putting a parent in the lowest level of hell, because the parent was abusive. And then it opens up a can of worms. Psychological, emotional problems in which the school counselors have to intervene. But on that level, I guess it can be quite comical. But anyway, so you get the idea of how we use the past can be problematic as teachers. Andrew Elliott's Medievalism, Politics, and Mass Media, Appropriating the Middle Ages in the 21st Century. Cinematic Illuminations, The Middle Ages on Film. That's a fun book. It's loaded with photos from modern day movies. Movie Medievalism, The Imaginary Middle Ages. The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages is a fascinating book. It's relatively short, and it's really quite fascinating. Here's one that just came out a year and a half ago. Excuse me. And I have found it extremely interesting. The Devil's Historians. How modern extremists abuse the medieval past. Those of you who are interested in that whole phenomenon of white supremacy and neo-Nazism and Christian nationalism, that's a really interesting book. The Middle Ages in Popular Imagination, Memory, Film, and Medievalism. And then a book written mainly for specialists, David Matthews' Medievalism, A Critical History. Okay? So again, any library can order these for you. You don't have to buy them. And I don't think this is going away. I think medievalism is here to stay. Hollywood has figured out that it sells. And people are willing to follow some of these series for years. You know, the series that is out on the Vikings. The series, the Game of Thrones series that was on for 8 years. And so forth. But let's talk about the great sensation of the 1980s in Europe. Okay? This is a special edition of the paperback book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The original came out in 1984, sold really, really well in Europe for about 3-4 years. Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It is about the Priory of Zion, a medieval mystical fraternity that included Leonardo da Vinci, Victor Hugo, medieval crusaders, medieval Templar knights. And this far-fetched story, excuse me, I've been talking nonstop for the last couple of weeks. This far-fetched story that the Priory of Zion and several other secret societies of the Middle Ages were intended to protect the Holy Grail. And there is a legend that says that they found the Grail in the Holy Land during the Crusades and brought it back to Europe. But what these 3 authors, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, propose in the book is that if you do the etymology of the word Holy Grail in Latin, it's Sang Graal. Okay, Sang Graal. Let me put that on the whiteboard. That literally means Holy Grail. In medieval Latin, San Graal. Graal literally means grail or chalice. But what the authors of the book claim in Holy Blood, Holy Grail is that maybe what they were saying was Sangra Real. Holy blood, royal blood. And they go ahead and they take the medieval legends of Mary Magdalene landing in the south of France after the crucifixion with a little girl. The legend says it was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. In other versions of the story, she lands with 2 little boys. And those little boys are the sons of Mary Magdalene and Jesus of Nazareth. Okay? If you go to the south of France and you tell the people there who believe this that they're crazy or that they're blasphemers or that they're just plain stupid, they'll throw you out of town. Because in the south of France, they take this legend so seriously that the region is even called the Magdalene. And they will tell you, here is the grave of St. Mary Magdalene. Here is the grave of her daughter Sarah. Here is the grotto where Mary came to pray and to meditate. And there's different churches in the south of France that claim to have different relics of St. Mary Magdalene and of her children. And the legend says that she brought Christianity to Europe. long before any of the male apostles got there. Okay? There's always a little bit of truth to every legend, but it doesn't really matter because the magic of believing is believing. And Holy Blood, Holy Grail, I wish I had not lost my paperback copy because the paperback copy is so much more modest. I mean, I only paid like $6.95 for it. And this special edition, okay, richly illustrated, I don't know, I think it cost me like $40. Designed to capitalize on the success of the Da Vinci Code. Now, these three authors took Dan Brown to court for about $70 million. And they lost their charge of plagiarism. However, I have to tell you that if you've ever read this book, you already know the plot of the Da Vinci Code. And if you've ever read the Da Vinci Code, you know the plot of this book. These three men were reporters. And the book, I remember when I first picked up the book, I got it from a French student of mine who knew that I was interested in the Grail legends. And she said to me, Dr. Hernandez, this is a major bestseller right now in my home country in France. I thought you might enjoy it. And she gave it to me in English, which she had bought in England. Okay? I couldn't put the book down. I just kept turning. I mean, I read it so quickly. And it's nonfiction, it's not literature. Okay? But you know, that's part of medievalism and popular culture, is being able to take an old story and reinterpret it and put the pieces back together in a different way for a different time and a different place. So in a way, what Michael Bygent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln do is no different from what the medieval storytellers and poets of the Grail tradition did. The whole point was that every new generation got a chance to take a shot at retelling the story for their own time and their own place, but maybe in a better way than anyone had ever told it before. So for me, this was a landmark publication, even though some of the stuff in it is silly, is overstretched, but to me it was fascinating. The ingenuity with which they took all these pieces and connected all these dots is worthy of an award, even if I'd get fired as a historian for writing this book myself. Okay? I don't mean that literally. But if this were my book, I'd be in trouble with other historians because they take liberties that I'm not allowed to take as a professional historian. Okay? That doesn't mean that I think this is false. I think there's a lot of truth in here, but it's not the whole truth. Okay? And of course, you already know the story if you saw the movie The Da Vinci Code or if you read Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. My dissertation, entitled Islam and the Holy Grail, was inspired by that book. And when Dan Brown's novel came out, oh my goodness, did I get invitations to speak all over the place. Okay? And I will never forget this man in Arvada at a church that had a whole special entire Sunday afternoon on the Da Vinci Code. The place was packed, and all kinds of people had their Da Vinci Code books in their hand. And I'll never forget the man who came up to me, pounding his copy, seriously, afterwards. I knew it, Professor, I knew it. I knew the church was lying to us. And I was like, and I remember leaning over and whispering, sir, it's a novel. It's fiction. And he just looked at me like, what's wrong with you? Think about that. And Dan Brown even tells us in the opening page, this is a novel. But I think that there are so many question marks that Christians have about the origins of Christianity and about the abuses of the medieval church and the Templars and chivalry and again this, medievalism, that, oh my God, Dan Brown has probably made $80 million. I mean, I have to look it up. But he's probably made $80 million or more off of all these books, you know? And we, you know, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, you love to demonize the medieval Catholic Church, okay? And it's interesting that as Dan Brown's stories evolve, Opus Dei becomes this sinister element within Catholicism, trying to hang on to the medieval power of the church, or to the power of the church from the Middle Ages. Opus Dei exists today. It is an arch-conservative movement within modern-day Catholicism. You know, I am very close to the Jesuit order. I am a product of Jesuit education. Some of my best friends are Jesuits. And I know that there have been tensions between the Jesuit order and Opus Dei bishops in different parts of the world, in different parts of the United States. I was once invited to speak in South Florida, and an Opus Dei bishop wanted to know, who is this Albert Hernandez? I hear he's a former Catholic, and what right does he have to come speak at a Catholic institution in South Florida? I was like, wow, man, I'm not even that important. I cannot believe. I felt like the Inquisition was trying to dig its claws into me. I was blown away. You know, I eventually the Jesuits said, no, we don't care. He's going to speak here whether you like it or not. Yeah, conspiracy theories are big. And we have so many conspiracy theories rooted in the Middle Ages because of all of the unresolved questions from medieval mythology, from medieval literature, from the medieval origins of modern countries and of modern nations, and even from the medieval origins of modern Christianity. You know, Roman Catholicism is one of the great power brokers of the Middle Ages. Protestantism comes out of the Middle Ages, right? Martin Luther is a late medieval monk, of all things. John Calvin is another late medieval religious person. They're not modern, by the way. These are medieval people who lived in the 1500s and early 1600s. Teresa of Avila is a late medieval, early modern woman. And remember what I told you last week? What was her favorite thing to do in her spare time? To read novels of chivalry, to read stories of chivalry and of the quest for the Grail. So anyway, yeah, I am amazed at, you know, well, I guess it says something about the creativity of taking a bunch of legends, a bunch of myths, and putting them all together. It says something about that. Remember what I told you in week 2 when we talked about the Grail. The Grail and King Arthur were completely separate stories. Completely separate. And in the 1400s, Sir Thomas Malory, okay, an English criminal, okay, yes, an English criminal who happened to be a very good writer, decided to take the Grail tradition and the Arthurian tradition and join them in a story called La Mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. Okay? English did not exist yet as you and I know it. The English upper class were all French-speaking, and many of them had dynastic and family ties to France and not to England. And so Malory writes most of the book in jail. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Sir Lancelot. Okay? And it is amazing how he takes these stories and ties them together, and in some ways makes the story even better. Even better. Because then when Camelot is on the verge of collapse, King Arthur says, we must find that which we have lost. Only the Grail can save us. Only the chalice of the Last Supper can restore us to our relationship with God. That is where we have failed. Our failure is a moral failure. Think about that, you know? And then the Grail starts to become synonymous with political theory. You know, justice in the political arena, justice in the personal domain. It's amazing how it even generates all kinds of ideals about political justice, political balance, political order. And again, in the same way that you see modern day people dressing up, or maybe decorating a room in a medieval style, people in England and in parts of France, as a result of the success of Malory's novel, start asking carpenters to build them round tables. Think about that. Okay? And what does the round table symbolize? A better version of feudalism, where you don't have a head of the table, but somehow power is shared through the ideals of chivalry and through the ideals of building a more just social order, a more just political arena. Okay? That's in Holy Blood, Holy Grail. That's in the Da Vinci Code as well. I would say the complication there is the whole bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. That's the thing that no one in the Middle Ages wanted to really touch with a 10-foot pole. Well, because the church was going to be like, that's blasphemous. Our Lord and Savior never sinned. He was never in a relationship. Come on. It's ridiculous. Oh, did I offend you? What if I told you that many in the early church believed that Jesus had lived into his 50s? And it's only later that we start to idealize him as someone who was crucified at age 33. Many of the earliest church fathers believed Jesus had been crucified when he was in his 50s. And it would have been rather unusual for a rabbi in his 50s to be single, unless he was an ascetic. Okay? An ascetic, which he may have been. He may have been. But clearly he has a relationship with a woman called Mary Magdalene. It's some kind of a relationship. You know, she is very special to him. And she is the first one to see him after the resurrection. So, you know, there's a whole ancient tradition of Gnostic texts, Gnostic Gospels, apocryphal texts, apocryphal Gospels. One of them known as the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And in it, we learn that Jesus left her in charge, not the men, and that he would often enter the home and he would kiss her on the. And unfortunately, that part of the text is burned and damaged, but we presume that he was kissing her either on the forehead or on the lips or on the cheek. And he doesn't walk around kissing any of his other followers. So again, if that is there in a text that the oldest ones date to around the year 350, so only 300 years after the lifetime of Jesus, I don't know. Doesn't turn me into a heretic. But wow, you know, what a stir the Da Vinci Code caused, and what a stir Holy Blood, Holy Grail caused. Even though for me as a historian, it was no big deal. I was like, oh yeah, we've known that story for centuries. Yeah, so what? Well, the public didn't know it. You know, like that man, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. The magic of believing is believing. Maybe that's the best takeaway from a class on medievalism and popular culture. You know, maybe truth doesn't even matter. Maybe historical accuracy doesn't even matter. The wonder of it all is the ways in which these things can speak to a new audience in a new time and a new place. And again, the magic of believing is believing, you know. Some have said that the Priory of Zion never existed, and others have said that the Priory of Zion definitely existed. And they say that it's from the Priory of Zion that French Freemasonry is born and that French Rosicrucianism is born. Two mystical fraternities that were very, very important in the creation of the modern world, which I mentioned on week 1. Okay? I don't know. Maybe there is some truth to that. I don't know if Leonardo da Vinci was a Grand Master of the Priory of Zion. I never thought of him as a Grand Master of anything. The other people that are mentioned, a bunch of them show up in lists of founders of Freemasonry and of founders of Rosicrucianism. The Rosicrucians are the Order of the Red Rose and the Golden Cross. That's what Rosacruz, Rose Croix. I know that word Rosicrucian doesn't sound very melodious. But a lot of those other names that are on the list do show up as founders of Freemasonry and as founders of Rosicrucianism. You know, I don't know. Maybe there is some truth to it. What do you think? I'm sure you've all either seen the movie or read the book or, you know. Questions, thoughts, reflections?
Well,
Yes.
having a family history from a grandmother to a father to a brother to a nephew, all Masons, they are not like Da Vinci and all of this. It doesn't seem all that mysterious, and yet this is an organization that has hung on, and I do believe George Washington was a Mason.
Definitely. No doubt about it. We have his apron, we have his wand, we have a bunch of his Masonic implements. Many in the Revolutionary War were Freemasons, many of the commanders. The Washington Monument is financed by Masonic lodges from all over the United States. Benjamin Franklin was a member of the Rosicrucian branch of Freemasonry. So was Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, you know, it had a very powerful appeal in the 1600s and the 1700s. Nowadays, though, they're not fighting tyranny anymore because the revolution succeeded. You know, the papacy isn't committed to their destruction, and they're not committed to the destruction of the papacy, which was part of the original story. So, you know, even though the Catholic Church still encourages Catholics to not become Rosicrucians or Freemasons, there are people within the Vatican employment who are Freemasons and Rosicrucians. Go figure, what does that mean? So, you know, I mean, in many ways, Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism have become a bit of a social club. But there was a time when the Rosicrucian movement and the Masonic movement were the hubs, if you will, of democratic revolution. Some would even say of Protestant revolution in the 1600s. And look, in a way, they gave us the modern world. You know, if you think the democratic revolutions in France and in the United States gave the world something of value, and you realize that even Napoleon's family were Masons, you know, or in almost all of the French democratic theorists were Masons. I mean, it's quite significant, you know. And almost all of the scientists involved in the scientific revolution were either Freemasons, alchemists, or Rosicrucians. There's something to that. There really is something to that. Freedom of thought was one of their greatest convictions, and the value of representative government was one of their deepest convictions. They said if in the Hebrew scriptures, if in the Bible, God can govern by contract, why can't we reorganize society by contract? Where the king or the sovereign pledges to do this, and the people pledge to do that. They tried it, and the monarchies would not cooperate. So then they decided they had to bring down the monarchies. And, you know, the world really did change, for better or for worse. Yep.
Kind of connected to by the way, I read that book in 1989.
Cool.
Yeah.
When it was still hot.
Yeah. But there's another thing in Kashmir. There's a tomb that a lot of people, at least in that area, believe where Jesus was actually buried. That he was actually taken off the cross, still alive, but just barely. He was
Yes.
nursed
Yes.
in order to get away from those that wanted to kill him, he went basically along the spice route, ended up in Kashmir and continued to teach there. And I guess they recently did a DNA thing, and they found that there's like in this certain little region where this tomb is, there's Jewish DNA, which really perplexed everyone. Because
Yes.
they were like, and near as they could trace it back, it was to that same time period.
Yes.
Another bizarre thing about it all was that Mary Magdalene was there, and then the story is that she left and went to France.
Wow.
For some reason. And,
Fascinating.
it's in their, it's in their little stories of their
Yeah.
region. And
Fascinating.
yeah, I always found it too, and I was like, gosh, what if that was the real deal also?
Well, there is a story that one of the apostles, Thomas, went east to take the gospel message to the east. And that may be associated with his group and his community, and not necessarily with Jesus. But who am I to say? I mean, there's always a kernel of truth in all of these legends and stories. And the fact that they got the other trajectory right, the one about Mary Magdalene ending up in France, when people in Kashmir shouldn't have had no awareness of that. It really, again, you got to ask yourself, there in the Gnostic Gospels, not in the Gnostic Gospels, but there is a Gospel of Judas. There are stories from the early church that Judas so loved Jesus that he traded places with him. And it's Judas who is crucified and not Jesus. There is that in the apocryphal tradition.
I thought Thomas went to Kerala down in southern India.
Yes.
There's that large
Yes.
Jewish community
Yes,
there.
that's what I meant, that he went east. But it would have taken him a long time to get to India. And you got to India easiest by way of Kashmir and the mountain passes. Instead of going this way, you had to go up and then down, which is how Alexander the Great got to India. Yeah.
He's also in Japan.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Who, Jesus is?
No, Thomas.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thomas.
Yeah. Yes.
I reread it, and I'm having, this time he says, Noah was an albino,
Noah?
from the ark.
Oh, I don't know about that one.
Okay, is that a true statement, or is that Brown taking it some other place, because the other guy, the bad guy, was an albino?
Oh, interesting. Yes, yes. I don't know enough about that. I haven't looked into it.
I was wondering, how do you look into something like that?
Again, there are dozens and dozens of apocryphal stories everywhere. It's just that when we think of the Bible tradition, we think of the canonical Bible. We don't realize usually that there are many, many books and many, many stories that didn't make it into the canonical Bible. There is an earlier version of the childhood of Jesus. You'll notice that we hear of his birth. We hear of the flight to Egypt. Next time we see him, he's 12 years old in the temple. Losing, when he ran off from his mother and father, and they find him talking to the Jewish scribes. There are other apocryphal versions of Jesus' childhood. One that I recall, he bumps into a child, and he's so powerful psychically, energetically, that in anger he stares at the boy, and the boy drops dead. Okay? They took that out for obvious reasons. There's another one in which he's showing off his spiritual powers, and he takes clay and he fashions them into two birds and he sets them free. Obvious reasons the early church fathers said, we've got to get that out of there. He's not a magician. And yet, magic was part of the worldview of Hellenistic and Roman civilization. Mystical phenomena was part of the worldview of the Judaism of Jesus' time. Mystical phenomena is a part of Judaism. The Kabbalah is about learning how to perform miracles in the physical world by aligning oneself with God's heart and God's mind. So I'm not saying those canonical, no, I'm not saying those apocryphal stories of Jesus as a little 5-year-old wizard are true. I'm just using it as another example of all of the possible stories that are out there. Remember, until around the year 350, Christianity could have gone in any number of different directions. It just so happens that it goes in the directions that it goes in because of the Orthodox fathers of the early church who want a unified teaching, a unified vision of the life of Jesus, so that they can give a unified witness in front of the empire that is trying to kill all Christians and destroy all Christians, until around 313 AD. So somewhere in the transit from 313 AD to 350 and forwards to 395, we get the Christianity that we recognize as Christianity. But for those first 313, 320, even 350 years, there are lots of Christians walking around thinking lots of different things about who Jesus was. And no one was telling them, you're going to burn in hell. Or worse yet, you're a heretic, and we need to take action against you. That comes later. I was stunned when I started finding all these references to the 50-something-year-old Jesus. I was like, really? Whoa. Where did that come from? Who knows? Maybe that was more true than the 33-year-old man who got crucified. But in the ancient world, it mattered a lot that if Jesus was the King of Kings, that he would have some of the pedigrees of the other kings. And there's a very famous king from the ancient world by the name of Alexander the Great, who is in the Quran. He's in the holy book of the Muslims. He had an inner circle of 12 generals. He called them his companions. And in Greek, kompanion means to break bread together. And legend says that on the day of Alexander's birth, a star appeared in the heavens, signaling the birth of a god king. And Alexander died when he was 33. And everywhere that he went, he was deified as a soter. In fact, his title was Soter. And Soter means savior. And we are even told that when he walked down the streets, he would sometimes do this, which is not a Christian symbol at all. It's a Persian symbol, and it means I bring order to the north, south, east, and west. So I really don't care. This doesn't make me a Christian or not make me a Christian. But if I was a Christian back then, I sure better hope that my soter has all these little pedigrees and symbols and connections that all the other soters out there in the world have. I don't even think that the 3 wise men is a true story. But it's a way for the early Christians to say, hey, you see this? Even the Persian kings, even the Persian magicians are saying, he's the new soter. And they came from the east by following the stars to bring gifts to the new savior of humanity. And the word soter in ancient Greek means savior. And who is a savior? The one who unites us. The one who unites us is a savior. And that's why they gave Alexander that title. So, I hope I'm not turning you into heretics. It says something about the ancient mind, the ancient heart, the ancient consciousness. It really believed more in things being interconnected than in things being true or false. And maybe that's the magic of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and maybe that's the magic of the Da Vinci Code. Maybe truth in the realm of the heart is something else. Maybe truth in the realm of the soul is something else. Maybe we live under the tyranny of scientific historiography. We want facts, 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 facts. I don't think the ancient mind cared about facts. They cared about the magic of believing. They cared about the theology of wonder. There's a good phrase. Theology of wonder. An Orthodox bishop that I once studied with told me that the whole history of the Grail, All the legends of the Grail, he said to me, Albert, are a theology of wonder. It doesn't matter whether it happened or not. It's the wonder of it all that draws us in. The wonder of it that draws us in. Maybe there's something to that. You know? Jesus is pretty open-ended, pretty open-minded. Who do you say that I am? I mean, you know, he doesn't say, I am this theological definition in the Book of Discipline. Or I am this theological definition in Thomas Aquinas' Summa. And if you don't believe it, you're not one of us. Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus says, who do you say that I am? Anyway, sorry, I'm getting carried away there. I should stop. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, yes.
Sort of to the Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Mary being a virgin, they make a big deal out of it, saying that that's actually a misinterpretation that came about during the Middle Ages.
Yes.
Is that true?
Well, I'm not a biblical scholar, but there are lots of misinterpretations. Biblical scholars of the New Testament have told me that where the scriptures say faith in Jesus, you could actually render the Greek to say the faith of Jesus. And that's dynamite. Because what it says is that Jesus is asking us to worship the Father versus what the church said about the divinization of Jesus. So yeah, you could make some of those moves. Mary and Joseph have other children. Okay? They're in the scriptures, and they're in the apocryphal tradition. And then the other thing is that Mary Magdalene is not the prostitute that Jesus saves from being stoned to death. There is no evidence of that in the scripture. It's just that when Mary Magdalene appears in the New Testament, the very next story is about the prostitute saved from being stoned. And yet, there's no evidence that it's the same woman. But a celibate clergy in the Middle Ages may have wanted to portray a celibate Jesus, even though that may not be part of Jesus' own life or of Jesus' own experience. And who knows? Maybe we would have gained something by having a Jesus who did live in a relationship with a partner. Mary Magdalene. Maybe we would have gained something. I'm not trying to be blasphemous or heretical, but the early church believed that the incarnation was the most important thing. And the early church, one of the favorite sayings in the early church was, God became human in Jesus so that we might ascend to heaven and reclaim our divinity. Or God became human in Jesus so that we might ascend to heaven and become angels. If that's true, then the humanity of Jesus was really, really important to the early church. By the year 320, 325, 350, we lose sight more and more and more of the human Jesus, and it becomes replaced by Jesus the Christ, Jesus the divine figure. And he's portrayed in ways that Jesus would never have wanted to be portrayed. Golden robes, purple robes, golden sandals, a golden belt, with a halo. The halo is another symbol of the ancient kings. All the ancient Soters were known by that halo. Of course we could say, well, no, that was the will of God. But I'm a historian, and I'm a Christian, yes, but I'm a historian. And it creates a very, I think, healthy tension in me. But the historian in me has to realize that the story of Christianity is a constructed story, and there are huge battles for which book do we live in, which book do we throw out, and then Christianity's battle with heretics, you're not one of us, out. I mean, come on, would Jesus talk that way about people? The Theodosian, the Roman law code of 380 to 395, known as the Theodosian canon of law, talks about heretics as gangrenous limbs that need to be removed from the body of the church in order to make the church healthy again. Would Jesus, I mean, come on, honestly. I know I'm sounding silly here, like WWJD, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus talk that way about another human being? Absolutely not. And yet the late Roman, early medieval church gets obsessed with who's one of us and who's not one of us. And it becomes a persecuting church. And I think that's part of what Dan Brown is capitalizing on. And that's part of what the three authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail were capitalizing on. You know, that kind of latent trauma and conspiracy theories. There's some huge cover-up. So, I'm sorry. Well, you'll have the last question.
How does the historian in you respond to Marcus Borg's movement and saying that all this is irrelevant and there's just these few glimpses that we have of the real Jesus?
I agree with that, because that's what my grandmother, who had a 4th grade education, and she was a Cuban peasant, seriously, okay, an uneducated woman, but educated enough to read the Bible, told me that I should always focus on the letters, on the words in red, the words of the living Jesus, and that I should try to connect with the living Jesus inside of me and not let the church lead me astray with dogmas and doctrines. And as a woman who was told she wasn't good enough because she was a woman, it meant a lot to her.
And that's the essence of it.
Maybe so. Maybe that's the great teaching of Jesus, to remind us of our full humanity, regardless of whether we're male or female, or poor or rich, or educated or uneducated. So that's a good place to end. Wow, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Gosh, you all really made me think.